The Jets announced their initial 53-man roster for 2024, but don't get too attached. There are likely to be changes. Let's talk about what they could be today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Wednesday, August 28th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts, so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast for us, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Well, we have our initial 53-man roster for the New York Jets. The team announced it yesterday afternoon. Team cut from 90 players down to 53 ahead of yesterday's deadline. Let's talk about this Jets 53-man roster, and let's begin on the offensive side of the ball. As far as the offense goes, when we talk about what the Jets did, I think the storyline is that there's still more to come. I viewed this roster, this initial roster, as kind of ending with a to be continued, because there were a couple spots where the Jets seemed like they kept extra players, and then there were some positions where it felt like they were kind of short. And you see this from time to time when a team submits its initial roster. Now, we always talk about this. Frequently, there are tweaks, in the days and weeks after the initial 53-man roster because other teams are cutting players that may interest you. So there's going to be some sort of turnover on your roster, but sometimes what you see is an initial roster where you can immediately notice that there are going to be changes. And I think if you look at how many players the Jets kept in certain positions versus other positions, you can tell that this is almost like a placeholder roster. There are going to be additional moves coming because there are some positions where the Jets are very light and some where they have an extra guy or two. At the quarterback position, they only kept two guys, Aaron Rodgers and Tyrod Taylor. Both Andrew Peasley and Adrian Martinez were released. One of them may end up on the practice squad. The late round pick this year, Jordan Travis, who is also a quarterback out of Florida State, he remains on the non-football injury list, which is where he began training camp. He's recovering from a leg injury last year, so he's eventually going to join the team as the number 3 quarterback, and he'll be the emergency quarterback on game day once he's healthy. Now, remaining on the non-football injury list means he's got to miss at least 4 games. But he'll eventually get here. And I think the Jets want to get him here as soon as possible because he's a developmental quarterback, and he can't start practicing until he gets off that list. So, you can't really start developing him until he gets off the list, but he has to heal up. He has to get healthy. So Jets are a little light at the quarterback position. A lot of teams are keeping 3. It seems like the Jets, at least at the start of the year, will keep 2. That will change. Jets are also very light at tight end, where they only kept Tyler Conklin and Jeremy Ruckert. Kenny Yeboah is on IR, so he'll begin the season on IR. So only 2 tight ends. Meanwhile, there were 4 running backs who were kept. That's a little excessive. Breece Hall, Braylon Allen, Isaiah Davis, Israel Abanikanda. 7 wide receivers: Garrett Wilson, Mike Williams, Xavier Gibson, Alan Lazard, Malachi Corley, Herb Charles, and Jason Brownlee. And 10 on the offensive line: Tyron Smith, John Simpson, Joe Tittman, Elijah Vera Tucker, Morgan Moses, Olu Fashanu, Wes Schweitzer, Carter Warren, Xavier Newman, and Max Mitchell. So Jets are light at quarterback, they're light at tight end, and they have an extra guy at pretty much every other spot. Now, I'm not surprised to see them keep 10 on the offensive line just because of what's happened the last couple of years with all the injuries on the offensive line. But you can see that there's probably going to be an additional move or 2 coming because I don't think the Jets can go into the season with 2 tight ends on the active roster. Yeboah is going to be, start the year on IR, so he could be coming back. But I don't think you're going to want to go into game 1 with only 2 tight ends because, first of all, what happens if you get an injury? Then you can't run any 2 tight end sets. But even now, you can't really run the heavy goal line packages because you only have 2 tight ends on the team. So I expect something to change. And like I said, there's an extra running back, there's an extra wide receiver, especially for someone like Jason Brownlee, who's not projected to help on special teams. It's one thing to keep a 6th receiver like Herb Charles, who isn't really a receiver, who's more just a special teamer. But Jason Brownlee's there. And even on the offensive line, I think Max Mitchell might be a little extraneous. Do the Jets really need a 5th tackle? I don't know. And at the running back position, we've talked a lot about how maybe Izzy Abanikanda is a tad extraneous. So those are the 3 guys who seem like the candidates to get cut eventually. With Travis, it's still a couple weeks away. But it seems like there are 3 guys who are pretty obvious. There's an extra running back, an extra offensive lineman, and an extra wide receiver who should be pretty easy to cut. And we may see the Jets, make some moves on that front. What were the surprise cuts? There's nothing shocking. I was a little surprised they did not keep Anthony Ferkser, just from the standpoint he's got fullback experience, and also it was a one-to-one move when the Jets signed. The Jets signed Anthony Ferkser and cut Nick Bawden. And my thought at the time was that they brought Ferkser in to be the fullback, but Ferkser brings more to the table because he's also got tight end experience, so he can play fullback and tight end. And also he's got more receiving skills than Bawden. So I thought that was kind of like a move to upgrade fullback, but the Jets cut Anthony Ferkser. So to me, that was the big surprise. And it wasn't that big of a surprise, but if we're talking about moves that caught me a little off guard, that was there. And I think they probably will have Ruckert play the fullback role. Ruckert, got some fullback snaps in the past, but I do think they'll need a third guy. What's left to do for the New York Jets on the offense as far as their roster goes? Well, again, first of all, just find a little bit more balance in the positional when it comes to positions, because again, they're light at quarterback, they're light at tight ends, they're maybe carrying an extra guy at running back, wide receiver, offensive line. They probably are going to look to find a little bit more balance on the roster. And that could happen through the waiver wire today. The Jets may end up claiming a player or two. The other thing that I think is to do for the Jets is the Jets should be even though this is weird, and this is part of the thing that I thought was odd, is that they kept 7 receivers. This receiver depth, is not that great. There's a lot riding on Mike Williams. Now, as long as Mike Williams is back and healthy, and it sounds like, took the next step in practice yesterday to getting back on the field. As long as Mike Williams is back and healthy, this receiver position looks solid. But they are depending on a guy coming off a serious injury. And look, I'm an optimist on Mike Williams, but I'm going to give, I think it's only fair to give the other side of the story that, look, they are counting on a guy who, is still, even at this point, late August, training camp now over, 53-man roster in, still kind of ramping up, not quite there yet. And after Williams, you've got Allen Lazard. I mean, he's Lazard. You've got Xavier Gipson. Now, maybe Gipson could take a step this year, but that's non-proven. You have Malachi Corley, who's still learning. You have Herb Charles, who's a special teamer. You have Jason Brownlee, who is, let's be honest, a practice squatter at this point. So I think the Jets, if you're looking at spots, the Jets should be active on the waiver wire today. I think wide receiver is up there. And look, I don't know that you're necessarily going to find a guy who could, be on the Garrett Wilson, Mike Williams level at that position. But, if you're looking at looking at the depth, I mean, you have Jason Brownlee on this roster right now as a wide receiver. I would have to imagine somewhere across the league, there's going to be a waiver player who's an upgrade on Jason Brownlee if you want to keep 7. And, I could even say, you could even say somebody who's an upgrade on Lazard, or, hopefully, maybe Xavier Gipson will take the next step forward. But if Xavier Gibson's the guy he was last year, there could be a guy who's an upgrade on him. I think, if you're looking at spots, the Jets should really be focusing on. I mean, obviously tight end, because they only have 2 on the roster. And I'm sure somebody, maybe Ferkser ends up getting re-signed. I don't know. Maybe they're playing some roster gymnastics with, the guarantees that veterans get in week 1, or I don't know. Maybe they're trying to juggle something else. I think that, they'll obviously be looking at tight end just because they're low on players there. They don't have enough bodies at tight end. But I do think wide receiver is another spot where the Jets should be looking to upgrade their depth, because I think it's fine right now. I think, like, if you have a number 3 receiver of Lazard or Gipson, you can live with that. But if anything happens to Garrett Wilson or Mike Williams isn't ready, then you're in a tough spot at wide receiver, and you can probably find an upgrade on one of those guys. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to the defense. It's the dominant unit on the team. I don't think there are going to be as many moves ahead for the defense, but there's one thing worth noting. There was one spot where the Jets are now loaded with young players, and we'll talk about what that is ahead here on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. You've heard me talk a lot about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Well, now I've got something a little different for you. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account, a current form of payment, and you can cancel it at any time. And if you're an out-of-market Jets fan, Sunday Ticket on YouTube and YouTube TV is a must, because Jets have a fair share of primetime games this year with Aaron Rodgers, but not all of them are in primetime. In fact, in that 3-week free trial, week 2 against Tennessee may not be shown in your area if you don't have NFL Sunday Ticket, or even if you live in New York. Jets have a couple of primetime games early in the season, week 1, week 3. Sunday afternoon, do you really want to be at the mercy of Fox or CBS, or do you want to watch the game you want to watch? The way to get it is to go to FanDuel. A $5 bet gives you a free 3-week trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to download America's #1 sportsbook. Thanks so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. And a big shout out to you, everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Today, we're breaking down the initial 53-man roster for the New York Jets. Let's turn our attention to the defense now. And I think the number one story for the Jets on defense is on the defensive line. Now, the Jets kept 10 defensive linemen, but that's not really the focus. We know Robert Saleh likes a deep defensive line. We know he likes a lot of rotation. I think 3 of these 10 guys are interesting because 3 of the 10 are undrafted rookies. So it's players that the Jets signed after the draft who made the team. And those 3 guys are Eric Watts, Braden McGregor, and Leonard Taylor. Watts and McGregor are listed as defensive ends. Taylor's a defensive tackle. 3 of them made the team. It's not unusual for undrafted rookies to make the team. In fact, if you look, historically through Jets rosters, usually there's 1 to 2. This year there's 3. Now you can attribute. It's pretty easy to see where the 3 came from. The Jets also have a defensive lineman who's on injured reserve, beginning of the season on injured reserve in Leki Fatu, and they have a guy who's holding out in Hassan Reddick. So if you factor in those 2 guys, you're probably back to your normal 1 to 2 range. The fact that these 2 guys are not on the roster right now, 2 defensive linemen, that's how you get to 3. 3 undrafted rookie signing or 3 undrafted rookies making the initial roster. But I do think it's notable to have all your undrafted rookies play the same spot. Now, Taylor's a defensive tackle, whereas Watts and McGregor are defensive ends. But, it reminds me of an old expression in baseball. And it's a rhetorical question. What's the best way to develop a pitching prospect? And the answer is typically begin with 5 to 10 pitching prospects because most guys don't pan out. And that's true when we're talking about undrafted free agent signings, certainly. Are Braden McGregor, Eric Watts, and Leonard Taylor all going to turn into good NFL players? No. There's pretty much no chance of that happening. There's pretty much no chance the Jets found 3 good NFL defensive linemen from their undrafted free agent class this year. But is there a chance one of the 3 could pan out? I think the odds of that's a realistic hope. And that's really, it really becomes a numbers game in a situation like this. And for a Jets team that has been short on draft picks the last couple of years and will likely continue to be short on draft picks in the near future because of the way they've managed their roster and because of the way they manage their resources, hitting on undrafted players is pretty important. And, of the 3, my guess is that Leonard Taylor, just based on the limited action I've seen from these guys in the exhibition season, my guess is Leonard Taylor's got the best opportunity out of all of them. But, you never know. I remember back in 2016, this was the early days of this podcast, I mentioned Jets had kind of a similar dynamic where they had two guys who were undrafted rookies. They had Jalen Marshall and Robbie Anderson, and then a guy who wasn't undrafted, but a 7th-round pick, Sharon Peake. And there were kind of like similar buzz around these guys. And I remember saying at the time that, the hope is that one of the 3 guys turns into a good player. And as it turns out, one of the 3 did turn into a good player. It was Robbie Anderson. The other 2, really, Jalen Marshall and Sharon Peake, never really amounted to much. So that's the goal for these guys. Out of these 3 guys, hopefully one of them turns into a good player. And, it's kind of funny when it works out this way. It doesn't always work out this way. Usually, like the undrafted free agents you keep play different positions. You usually don't load up in one area. Again, I think that's probably a dynamic of just the fact that Jets have 2 defensive linemen who are starting the year, who are supposed to be important parts of the team, not starting the year on the official 53-man roster. But now you've been with 3 at the same position, and maybe one of them can work out. As far as surprises go on the defensive side of the ball, I don't think there were a ton. Last week I did a couple shows where I did 53-man roster projections. And on the offense, I had some misses. On the defense, I may have missed 1 or 2, including Reddick being back. I think for the most part, I got it right. I guess if there was a surprise, it was keeping 5 linebackers and one of them being Chaz Surratt and one being Zaire Barnes. I thought the Jets would go in a different direction. We'll talk about that in a bit. But I think this was mostly chalk. I just mentioned last week when I did the projection, I thought it was going to come down. I thought the last spot would come down to Braden McGregor versus Eric Watts. Well, I also thought Hassan Reddick would be here by now. So, the fact if Reddick wasn't here, they probably would have had to choose between one of those 2 guys. One of them wouldn't have made it. So I guess maybe that's the other surprise. I don't know how much of a surprise Hassan Reddick not being here is, though. So I think, though, for the most part on defense, there was a lot of chalk. The Jets kept 6 defensive ends: Jermaine Johnson, Will McDonald, Michael Clemens, Tack McKinley, McGregor, and Watts. 4 defensive tackles: Quinnen Williams, Javon Kinlaw, Solomon Thomas, and Taylor. The 5 linebackers: Mosley, Williams, Jamie Sherwood, Chaz Surratt, and Zaire Barnes. 6 corners: Sauce Gardner, DJ Reed, Michael Carter II, Brandon Eccles, Jarek Bernard, Convis, Quantez Stiggers. Safety: Tony Adams, Chuck Clark, Ashton Davis, Isaiah Oliver. 4 guys at safety. So, pretty much what a lot of us were expecting heading into there. Not a ton of this. I think maybe the linebackers, there was a surprise or two. The fact they kept 5 and the fact they did not keep the guy who was one of their top special teamers from a year ago. We'll get to that shortly. But nothing shocking from the Jets as far as that goes. What's left to do on defense? Well, the Hassan Reddick situation. You hope that eventually resolves itself one way or another. I mean, it could be, hopefully Reddick just reports himself this week and the Jets don't need to take any additional action. But, look, the Jets are a better defense with Hassan Reddick. There's no question the Jets are a much better defense with Hassan Reddick. I mean, I understand the excitement around these undrafted rookies. You always hope you find a gem. You hope you find a diamond in the rough. But look, if the Jets cut Eric Watts, he'll make it to the practice squad. He shouldn't have much trouble making it to the practice squad. If the Jets have to cut Brady McGregor, the odds are very good he's going to make it to the practice squad. You need Reddick back because you can't really view this that like anything Reddick gives you as a bonus because you're not starting from like where you were a year ago. It's not like you have everybody back and Reddick is just supplementing what you had last year. A lot of production walked out the door when Bryce Huff signed with Philadelphia and John Franklin Myers was traded to Denver. That was a lot of quality snaps at the defensive end spot that are no longer here. And I think the objective was that Reddick combined with a Will McDonald breakout would at least match that, if not be better. I think the goal was for it to be better than what the Jets had last year. So, I don't know how this Reddick situation gets resolved, but that's what's left to do for the New York Jets because they have a star edge rusher who's not on the team right now. And, we can debate how much the Jets are to blame for that. And I think they have to take their share of the blame for it. Look, it's a tough spot because I think they've put themselves in a tough spot because Reddick, you can't just give Reddick a blank check right now for a number of reasons, but you just hope the situation is resolved. Hopefully it's that Reddick just made his statement. My hope is that Reddick just made his statement and now is ready to report and realizes, you know what, I'm going to start losing game checks right now. I'll just play the season out and sign somewhere this offseason. But, that's really what's left to do for the New York Jets because, look, they have 10 defensive linemen, but the guy who's the best pass rusher out of those 10 is still nowhere to be found. The header on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to the third phase of the game. What about the Jets on special teams? What's notable about this roster? I think there was one thing that really stood out to me. There was one cut that was a surprise. Maybe it should not have been such a surprise, though, and we'll talk about who that is and why it was, continuing here on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Gametime. Gametime now has a new feature called Gametime Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Gametime Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Gametime was already one of the best ticket sites out there. If you need a last-minute ticket at a reasonable price, Gametime's been the place to go. I've used it myself. Just pull out your app even an hour or two before your event begins. You can't believe the deals you get. And you also get the view from your seat. They give you a picture of what it'll look like from where you're sitting. So no surprises when you arrive, no obstructed views that you weren't expecting. It's always available there on Gametime. You want to go out to see the Jets week 1 in San Francisco. Gametime's the place to get in on the action. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDONNFL, one word with no space for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Game time. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Wednesday. We're breaking down the initial New York Jets 53-man roster for 2024. Of course, there are going to be some changes, but one thing that's reliable, the special teams for the Jets. Jets have consistently been good since Brant Boyer took over in 2016. Maybe a year or two where they've been down, but under Boyer's leadership, the Jets have had excellent special teams. Part of it's due to coaching. I think part of it's due to roster construction too. Boyer seems to have a say over the players the Jets keep on their roster on special teams, and Jets also had an excellent trio of specialists a year ago. Greg Zuerlein did a very solid job as the place kicker. Thomas Morstead finally back with the team after a successful stint in 2021. He was cut, finally returned to the Jets in 2023 and put together an excellent season. And we like him because he comes on the show frequently. And then Thomas Hennessy, the longest tenure member of the Jet, a guy who goes all the way back to the Todd Bowles era, the long snapper. If you're a long snapper, you're going to become beloved in the league because the real fans know you. The real fans always know who the long snapper is. And long snappers usually don't mess up. Long snappers usually have a pretty good success rate. So Thomas Hennessy, a very well-liked guy. The guy before him, Tanner Purdom, was a very well-liked guy. The guy before Purdom, James Dirth, was a very well-liked guy. It's good to be a long snapper in this league. Jets keeping 3 very solid guys. That's the top story. The top story is that there's no shocking, the guys is that there's consistency. After years of struggling to fill these spots, the Jets, it feels like they have a good battery when we're talking about punter, place kicker, long snapper, and the punter is also the holder. Consistency is good. That's the top story for the Jets on special teams. Surprises, there was one move that surprised me a bit. It was a cut, and it was a linebacker, Sam Aguavin. And you may not be familiar with the name. I thought he was going to make the roster. In fact, on the defensive side of the ball, that may have been my one surprise. I talked about Chaz Surratt and Zaire Barnes making the team and the Jets keeping 5 linebackers. Aguavin being cut is a surprise to me, but it's not because Aguavin was a linebacker. It's because he was a guy who played a ton of special team snaps for the Jets last year. Over 70% of the special team snaps Aguavin played. And as I mentioned, Brent Boyer tends to have say over the construction of the roster, especially those back few spots. When you're talking about maybe 45 through 53 or something, somewhere in that range. Because the guys at those positions, they may be like your number 5 linebacker or your number 6 wide receiver, like Irv Charles. They're never going to see the field. And even if they do, like the difference between them and some other guy you can get, it's not going to be that big of a difference. You're going to sign some guy off the street, probably be as good as Aguavin or Charles at his natural position. It doesn't really make a difference. But where these guys can make an impact is special teams, because these guys get regular snaps on special teams. So I was a bit surprised to see Aguavin go, but maybe I should not have been so surprised, because while Boyer does seem to like certain guys on special teams, he's also not afraid to churn the roster a little bit. So I remember a couple of years ago, Delshon Phillips back in 2021, I thought he was the best special teams player the Jets had on the roster at that point. And he was gone with the cuts in 2022. So part of this means that, I think, Boyer does not fall in love with players. Boyer, I think, understands that, just because a guy was good last year doesn't mean he's going to be great for you this year. And also, I think Boyer is maybe a little adaptable. He's not going to put his foot down on certain guys, even if they're great special teamers, if the Jets think a roster spot can be better spent elsewhere. Because it's like kind of putting together a piece of the puzzle. Did the Jets need to keep 10 defensive linemen? No. But if they wanted to, keep all 3 of these undrafted rookies and continue to get them the reps, maybe Aguavin's a guy you sacrifice. Or maybe, maybe Boyer's been coaching up Zaire Barnes. Maybe Boyer thinks Barnes is ready to take on a bigger role on special teams this year. Either way, I have a lot of faith in Boyer to make this work. And I guess we'll close by talking about what's left to do on special teams. Hey, scout the waiver wire. If there's a great special teamer somewhere, hopefully the Jet scouts, their pro personnel department have found him. Hope maybe the Jets can bring in another contributor or 2 on special teams. I mean, some of the guys they brought in recent years have ended up being pretty good special teamers for this team. And look, it's an underrated. I maintain it's an underrated part of the game, especially like this year. The Jets have big goals. This year, the Jets want to do big things. There's talk about making a run in the AFC. Well, everybody's really good in the AFC. The top teams are all really good. They all have, most of them have really good offenses and really good defenses. One area that can set you apart is special teams. Everybody's got a good offense and a good defense. Having good special teams could be a difference maker. It may only move the needle a little bit, but when we're talking about the very top of the conference, every little bit helps. So Jets, certainly need to keep their eyes out for guys who can help them in the third phase of the game. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the show. Enjoy your Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.